there's going to be a convergence of innovative processes between China and the West.
China is strong, but the US is basically leading.
Huawei is extremely innovative.
Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk about how to measure Chinese innovation. We are going to have a look at how you measure innovation in the West and how it's different in China. We're going to discuss what innovation is, and we are also going to look at some case studies, which we dug out 3 case studies, and we hope to make this very complex topic as interesting for you as possible. Today it's the 3 of us again. Hello, Charlie. Hello, Kimo. Good morning.
Morning.
Hey.
I will start with speaking or introducing how you measure innovativeness and innovation in the West. And then Kimo and Charlie will follow with having a look at the Chinese angle. Okay, so in the West, you usually have a technology-based approach. You usually look at, for example, the company's R&D. You measure innovations like how many patents were registered and filed, how many patents claims did the company have. You look at the patent quality. And one remark here, usually this is also the dimension which is significantly important for venture capital, because venture capital looks at especially in the technology space, we look at how many patents a company has to judge the innovativeness of an early stage business. And then you look further dimensions such as R&D spending or the R&D intensity. And R&D intensity is usually measured as a percentage of R&D spending in relation to total sales. You can also add the external intellectual property to it. So bigger companies start buying other external IP to add to their portfolio. It can be via corporate venture capital activities, or it can also be via mergers and acquisitions. So they basically buy other companies or buy other companies' IP to add to their R&D and keep their innovativeness over time. And then you can also have a look at the output factors, which is factors like how many new products did the company launch, how many new processes did the company apply to actually make this innovation process and product launch process more smooth, and how much funding was going into optimizing these structures in the background. And are they also entering new markets frequently? These are 4 perspectives or 4 dimensions that US National Academy for Sciences proposed. And then you can actually take it one step further to summarize this. You can also look at the revenue originated from these new products. So you can actually further draw numbers such as percentage of revenue from new products, percentage of profit from new products, or percentage of revenue growth from new products, innovation, ROI, or similar KPIs that you can apply in the company. Well, this is the external perspective, as I said. That does not 100% work in China, as we found. So why is that actually so? And how is innovation measured in China?
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question, Betty. And, a lot of things are different in China compared to a more Western-centric perspective. And, after going a lot of literature on this topic, I've discovered that there are 2 sort of consensus on the sort of the angle regarding innovation. So there's first in China, there's a government-driven innovation. And I would argue that corporate venture capital activities is most salient in industries of national strategic priority. And this is not something that I've came up with. It's actually something that was noted by Premier Li of China. And in one of his speeches in 2014, he actually addressed that the Chinese government has led a major push to remove any obstacles to entrepreneurship, and they're in a process of trying to catalyze transformations across the economy in terms of innovations. And therefore, they have introduced multiple industries that are tagged as the strategic emerging industries. and they want to nurture a group of world-leading companies in these industries. And so they're not only just saying this with words, they're also making tangible supports to these industries and to these specific companies, as they're having a lot of recognition of different companies, by the name of Little Giants, which we have covered, in previous podcasts. And these little giants are actually government-backed companies that receive government fundings and grants and a lot of favorable terms and conditions in terms of their tax and funding structures. And the second one is more market-based. So a lot of investors in China are actually attracted to entrepreneurial ventures that pursue growth by serving a rapidly expanding market needs. And so these firms are, firms in China are more likely to explore this kind of market-based growth opportunity in munificent industries. Munificent industries is basically industries that experience dramatic growth in consumptions and in sales. And in these industries, there's a common factor is that the R&D intensity is very moderate and it's not super high, as opposed to, say, very hardcore, tech companies. And so this Chinese corporate venture capital activities predominantly follows what the literature calls harness industry growth technique. And these entrepreneurs are embracing, yes, they're still embracing innovative technologies, but they focus less on pioneering new technologies, but rather trying to fix the current technologies and improve them, and to try to serve a broader market and try to gain more market share in that regard. This actually has some history as to the Chinese sort of government-based investments, and historically in China, the government has led investments in a lot of technological innovations and infrastructure. And so it's very similar to other developing economies such as India, Brazil, and Malaysia, where only a smaller fraction of the local startups actually develop very breaking through technologies. Rather, these entrepreneurial ventures in China utilize and customize existing technologies and try to deploy them into the domestic market, so that they often rely on knowledge transfer from multinational corporations. And so there are actually some statistics in China that can back up these observations, because it is estimated that only a third of novel innovations outcomes actually originates from startups in China. But there is a recent trend that we witnessed, which indicates that there's going to be a convergence of innovative processes between China and the West. And this is going to dramatically change the landscape with which the Chinese startups are trying to innovate. And it's very different for different industries. And Kimo, you've done some research on recent trends in China, and you have successfully put up a lot of statistics regarding the most successful Chinese sectors. Do you have a take on this particular subject?
Absolutely. Yeah, innovation in China really depends on the industry. So it's very specific. Some industries have an easier time to innovate, and some industries have a very different relationship between R&D spending and actually outputs. So some industries to highlight where China is really active are the semiconductor industry, robotics industry, then computer, high performance computing, and also AI. And especially you can see from the data that China and the US have been competing toe to toe in many of them. So number of patent publications, for example, in the semiconductor industry, have been around 90,000 for China in 2021, before basically the crackdowns and the effects of those hit and catapulted a bit more down, now being below the US, but still above the average of other countries. Also, one can see for like consumer electronics, it's a case basically that China is strong, but the US is basically leading. And when we look at AI, we can see that the same struggle has been here. What's very interesting is that Alibaba has led the way on patents for digital payments over the last 3 years, which is also something that influences the world. And China has a lot of that digital and AI innovation basically in their pipeline. So tables will turn, and China will not only be a country that's basically investing in growth, but also investing in proprietary innovation. Also, another trend that can be seen in China is China's digital Silk Road, where you can see that China seeks to export its vast array of digital technologies from 5G to AI, AI surveillance cameras, for example, with the hope of promoting its technology companies around the world. And Chinese firms partner with research centers, companies, and governments, boosting economic growth, creating local jobs, and allowing for technology transfer. What you can also see is that the EV supply chain has been an innovation ecosystem energized by the state. And this is really something that comes back to also state subsidizing. And this goes along the lines what also happened to renewable energy progress in China. Renewable energy in progress in China is something that the government didn't really anticipate, but the companies have been growing so strong naturally and organically, so that the Chinese government doesn't need to subsidize them anymore, but they basically have subsidized them at the beginning, and now they have unfolded their own innovation, especially due to strong R&D spending and betting on a certain technology. But one has to understand basically that R&D spending and patent activity are not the same. So basically, there's a significant difference between R&D efficiency rates between industries, and that patents are granted is a better indicator for firm performance than R&D activity, basically, because you can really see the output. Corporate governance and innovation is also very important when you talk about trends in China. So ownership determines investment activity. Lastly, for the trends, I think it's very important to highlight the benefits of innovation co-creation. And here's a question: why or why not would you do it alone, or why would you co-create? And is co-creation a zero-sum game? Basically, on the fence of doing it is why would you doing it? Why would you do it? You can pool cost, you can reduce risk, you have strategic considerations that are basically helpful, interdependence in resources and also social relations. And collaborations can be effective in tackling complex policy problems, especially for foreign firms coming to China. For a long time, they only could enter and do business in China with a venture, with basically a joint venture. And for innovation, collaborations can be effective because they can basically help with interdisciplinary teams and sharing knowledge that might be very expensive for one single company. And the question is now, why wouldn't you do it? Why wouldn't you do innovation co-creation or innovation collaboration? And the boundary conditions here are very important. So there are basically 4 main boundary conditions. And the first one is efficiency. So you would basically see that coordination and exchange cost is there. So basically, anytime you take your manager and coordinate with somebody else, it takes actually their resources and their mental power. Then you have power structures that are in the place of collaboration, and basically you give up influence when you collaborate with somebody. Basically, you share knowledge, and in the long run, you also might share control. And the next one is basically competence. So lack of resources and capabilities for the product development might be a problem to collaborate because you simply don't have the capabilities to do so. And the last one is basically lack of strategic fit, where there's no coherence and collaboration, and it might not be confirmed with your company image.
Yes, I think we learned that measuring R&D activity or measuring innovation is quite complex and can be looked at from different angles. And we also learned that it's worth having a look at the output factors as well as the input factors, and that in China we used to have a bit more focus on consumer tech, where we have certain limitations when measuring R&D activities. Just as a short recap before we dive into our case studies, as Kimo said, I'm going to start with MACV. We discussed that earlier on. We launched that case study as one of our previous episodes, but this is supposed to be a short recap, and I'm also looking more at the R&D measurement here. I think it's very clear from what we discussed before that MACV is very research intensive and invests a lot in R&D. We learned that it is running one of the biggest R&D centers, and it's also having, I think, 4 big R&D centers in China alone. Plenty of R&D centers across the world. So, and a lot of money is being put into R&D in this company. Innovation performance is usually measured also looking at the quality of the patents. Well, I'm not a patent expert, so it's really difficult for me to judge. But what you can do is you look at the international patents and if the patent claims could be defended. So looking at the international patents, I just did a quick research on what we find, for example, for the US. I found 16 patents in the US. What is also interesting is looking at how frequently the company files or registers patents, and I only draw the numbers for the US to see what the international dimension can be, and it's not covering Europe, it's not exhaustive, it's not like we talked about 1,300 patents in total. So this is just to give you some examples. In 2020, for example, they almost filed or registered an international patent in the US on a monthly basis. It was 10 patents in 2020. And this shows how frequent they are pursuing this R&D activity. One of the other dimensions that we discussed before is that many Chinese companies didn't pioneer new technologies in the past. Well, in the AI space, it's quite obvious. In AI is a new industry sector, so there's no historical comparison. And of course, every company now in the AI space, because it's so new, is somehow pioneering its own niche sector. And for MACV as a big player, obviously that's very true, because they are pioneering their space. And so what we learned, what Charlie introduced, that often Chinese entrepreneurs embrace innovative technology but focus less on pioneering technologies. That's obviously not true in all these new industry sectors. And we also discussed in previous episodes that these new industry sectors are the ones that you will find in the 5 years plans. So it's everything that the Chinese government defined as such new innovative spaces. And what we also learned about MACV is that they have the exclusive ownership of this technology. So they are not only buying it off other companies, but they have this as a core of the company, which adds to this as well. Another, and this is the last perspective that I'm going to introduce, another factor that I had a look at was how the international patents or the performance of the company is valued by venture capital investors, because we also learned when looking at how innovation is measured in the West, that venture capital firms usually look at how many patents have been registered when valuing the value of the company in an early stage. And MACV was able to raise $1.9 billion in 9 rounds of different investors. Actually, before they IPO'd, they took on board several investors such as Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Foxconn Technology, SK Group of South Korea, the Macquarie Group from Australia, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, or Innovation Works from the USA. So you see they have these broad range of international investors on board, which is also a sign that their innovativeness and innovation is valued not only in China, in the local market, but on an international scale. I think that's it. I'll hand over to you, Kimo, because you are going to introduce the next case studies. Let's see what we find out there.
All right, I will talk about our second case, LONGi Green Energy Technology. And this company is an especially striking case because their market success can be attributed to their R&D activity. So instead of going the safe route and investing in polycrystalline cells like the rest of the market did. Basically, those are crystalline cells that are manufactured by bringing together different materials and having a more simplified process that is less risky in the manufacturing steps. And instead of going this route, they went for polysilicon cells, which have a higher efficiency, but at that point in time have been a huge gamble. So the gamble was if you can get them stable enough to reach any price parity with what was out there, and basically LONGi Solar took that risk and applied for many patents and invested a lot of R&D money in developing polycrystalline cells for their solar panels, as well as integrating vertically at the same time. So a lot of spending. A lot of well invested money, but a lot of risk as well. So, and I think that says a lot about how innovation orientated this industry is. And same as the AI industry, as McVie before, the solar industry has a very important standing in China. Now the question is, how do you, of course, get this to price parity with coal, for example? How do you transport the energy produced by solar? That's the next question. But what is clear that the production of solar cells by those companies is really going very well and growing exponentially, and that is due to high innovativeness. With these newer cells that actually can have outperformed the current market and have made it possible for LONGi to reach market leadership. And I pass on to the Huawei case with Charlie.
Thank you, Kimo. Yeah, those were great case studies by you guys, and it really lays out a good foundation for what I'm going to talk about, which is the Huawei case study. And I'm going to talk about it in two perspectives, one being the spending side of it, in terms of R&D, and the other being the patent side of it. As you all know, Huawei is a huge Chinese tech company. It designs and sells telecommunications equipment and also consumer electronics. And from a spending perspective, it is by far the most innovative company in China, and it has spent roughly 142 billion Chinese yuan in R&D in 2021, and that's roughly about 22 billion US dollars. So that is a huge amount, and it actually accounted for about 22% of its revenue. And I really wanted to do a little bit benchmarking and compare this number to the companies that we've talked about earlier, the innovative Chinese companies, as well as benchmark it against their US competitors. And so for Huawei, right, it was roughly 22%. Of its R&D to revenue. And for LONGi, it was actually a bit lower, roughly 11%. And that is because LONGi is in a different industry, right? It's in a solar panel PV industry. So it's a little bit difficult to compare. But for McVie, it has actually roughly a 65% of percentage of R&D to revenue, meaning that one additional dollar that the company gets from revenue is spent 65 cents in R&D, which is a very dramatic number. And if you benchmark it against top US innovative companies, in the tech sector, such as Google, Amazon, and Meta, you can see that Google spends roughly 12% of its revenue on R&D, and Amazon the same, roughly 13%. And for the parent of Facebook, Meta, is roughly 21%. So as you can see, these companies are really up against these American competitors and even spending more money on R&D than its American counterparts. And looking at it at another angle, at a patent angle, Huawei is also extremely innovative. And in the past 5 years, there were actually more than 2 billion smartphones that has been produced under Huawei's 4G and 5G patents. And it is estimated that 8 million internet connected vehicles using licensed Huawei technology are being delivered to consumers every year, and actually pushed it into the fourth place among all global companies on the list of largest US patent portfolios. And this is just an amazing result achieved by Huawei. It's one of the lead, most innovative company in China so far. So, in light of this, in light of all these companies that we've talked about, do you guys have any other thoughts on, just innovation, measuring innovation, and how to achieve innovation in China in general? Is there, any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I would be interested in how, like, what percentage of this, like, big R&D spending that you just introduced of Huawei, Charlie, for example, is also coming from or is supported by support that Huawei receives from the Chinese government. I think they are still getting funded by the Chinese government.
Sure, maybe we can very quickly go back to the cases. So, what did you think basically been the main factor for Huawei? Has it been more that they spent a lot of R&D, or they have been there for the right patents for AI? What do you think is important for the future?
What is definitely important for the future is that they build these R&D centers, which are not only internal R&D centers, but follow more the cluster approach that we traditionally had in the West. So you usually like building a cluster means collaborating with the local government and local support institutions. But also collaborating closely with universities. So tackling these lists like this R&D, not only from an internal angle, but also via collaboration, as you said also before, Kimo, collaboration in R&D is important. It can slow you down, but how McVie organizes it is setting up these quite independent research centers that have these close connections to the government, to the universities, draw this funding also from the government and the local governments for these this separatist research, which then also influences the AI strategy in China, or sets new standards in AI in general in China, or on a global scale.
There are also a few boundary conditions that basically apply to Longvi, and for Longvi be able to see that they lacked a lot of strategic fit at the beginning because they were so different from what has been out there in the supply chain. So they really needed to take a bet. But on the other hand, they were able to have low transaction costs economics. Also, I think they had an advantageous management of external strategic dependencies, as they are quite a strong player in the market. So they were able to play this for their side. It needs to be said that China is still the leader for solar power for the foreseeable future, but others are catching up. So the question is really, what do they do for future innovation? Do they concentrate domestically, or will they extend the maybe innovation co-creation to other partners where they would actually sell, for example, sell in Europe and also work together with European players directly? It really depends on what the future has in stock, right? So what do you think, Charlie, about your case about Huawei, and what is the potential for innovation co-creation in the future, or collaborations in the value chain there, and what would be the boundaries to that?
And how, I would also be interested in how much university collaboration plays a role in your two case studies and your two examples.
Yeah, those are all great questions. And I think Huawei, the company is very huge. It spends a lot of money on R&D, but it actually receives a lot of funding from the government as well, because it's one of the strategic area that the Chinese government wants to focus on. And it actually, brings me to an interesting topic, is to compare the different types of R&D expenditures, across its scopes. So by scopes, I mean there are three different types of R&D spending. One is business R&D, and this is usually spent by big corporations such as Huawei or Longyi that we've mentioned earlier. But there's also the second type is higher education R&D, and this is actually something that China can improve on. And the third type is obviously the government expenditure on R&D. So that's basically something that I've came across to me in my research.
Which is really, really interesting. So would you say that currently China can somehow leverage the weakness in the higher R&D spending at the universities through the government R&D spending? How does this, what have you found? How does this affect overall innovativeness? Is that something that is mentioned in a lot of surveys, a lot of assessments that you found?
Yeah, definitely. So higher educational R&D is definitely an emphasis that China needs to take in its future. And I think you are exactly right in that China can leverage its very high substantial attention, or the amount of money being poured into the government R&D, and really use that sum of money to try to help navigate the higher educational R&D and to propel its progress so that it can match the Western institutions that are just being so innovative in many regards. And so I think that's the one of the key drivers for Chinese innovativeness in a few decades.
Especially to accelerate the little giants, right? Because I think we discussed in the former episodes that the big tech companies in China have grown too powerful, and they are fueling the innovativeness and the innovation processes in China, as we just learned. Because the R&D spending at the universities is lacking behind, so it's really like these big tech companies with their internal research centers fueling innovation, and they are supported by the government. So if the government says that these companies have grown too powerful, this might also partially apply to their R&D spending. That's just my guess. So if they just take this money and put this into, for example, university R&D spending, or somehow navigate it to the little giants or the smaller innovative companies, I think that's also already leveraging out this like power problem that you traditionally have with these very powerful big players.
I think China especially shines in investing early in potential companies and basically seeing potential, and that makes a difference. If they do it correctly with this small and medium sized enterprises on a broader scale, which are now the little giants, they can basically shift the power balance to this engine of the middle class, which I talked about before. And I think that's also a very proven model in Germany, and that could actually bring China forward in the long haul. Because now we basically see in China that China is no longer this developing, fast growth country. If you look at the sentiment in China, you feel like many companies want to hold on what they reached already. And so it's time for more stability. And stability is obviously when you put the weight on more shoulders. And so this model is significant for the future. And in my opinion, is a right way to go.
Yeah, because from an international perspective, looking at the startup environment, the universities are the cradle of these innovative startups that you see in the US or in Europe. And we in Europe and the US have this approach of really strengthening universities, both at this like R&D level, like the general research level, but also this is another perspective or another important pillar of R&D spending at universities, that you also strengthen the startups, the startup centers, the entrepreneurship centers as the cradle that helps to use the R&D and the inventions developed at the universities and spin them out of the universities as innovative startups?
Yeah, I think it really has innovation and investment vehicle innovation can carry a lot of weight in this consideration and this environment. And what you can basically see that the early stage investment and government subsidies definitely create a good of positive forces. But one has to consider that the typical like Silicon Valley model and the typical like US, for example, Stanford University has this typical Ignitus group is like a group just for entrepreneurs where like new startups are founded. And they have this like a try and fail mentality. And it's of course a bit different, but in a different cultural context. But if you would bring it a bit more to the universities in China, then you would also be quicker to have this cutting edge innovation, and you would maybe even be able to save some of those subsidy money because you don't need to invest that much to develop innovation, as it is basically developed for free in the innovation in the university innovation headspace, or basically think tanks that do it basically for their own education. So I think would be a win-win situation and not a zero-sum game if you would try to relocate that a bit more to the university space. But that's just my opinion. What do you think about that, Charlie? Do you think that's realistic in the Chinese environment?
No, yeah, I definitely think that's a super realistic and a achievable target in a Chinese sort of environment. Well, you're right in that, there's a lot of emphasis in the Western parts of the world, specifically US and Europe, and they place a lot of strategic importance in R&D within the higher educational sector, because I'm here right now. I'm studying at UC San Diego, and it's a super research oriented institution with a lot of STEM research going on. And it's the same thing goes on that you were mentioning earlier at Stanford, that there are a lot of startup sort of type of nurturing environment. And I definitely think that is a type of sort of model that can be implemented in China as well, and that these higher educational institutions are going to serve as the epicenter of innovation and really try to drive the growth for China and all these different sciences in the next years to come. And I think that's really an achievable model, but also a type of sort of target that China needs to chase after. And yeah, that's really good discussion, guys. I mean, we've covered a lot of grounds today. Any other closing thoughts?
Well, no, I think it's a great summary, actually. Thank you very much. I think it's you cannot really add anything more interesting to this. And no further thoughts from my side. I think what is actually the next topic, Kimo, that we're going to have a look at? I think from here we're going to jump to biotech next time.
Yeah. So the next time we're gonna have a wonderful guest on our show. His name is Andrews. He is a graduate from Cambridge University, and he is currently working on cutting edge cancer research. And he's working on a startup in that space as well. So something very interesting to talk about. We will spotlight the difference between the Western and the Eastern biotech landscape, and see where differences are. And we will touch on this topic that we discussed today, especially when it comes to patents, because patents also play a significant role in biotechnology, and how the biotechnology environments and ecosystems differ in the East and West, and how these differences create different competitive dynamics.
And I'm sure we can use what we found in today's discussion for our next episode when looking at this biotech space. Yeah, pleasure to talk to you again. Great discussion. Thank you very much, Charlie, also for contributing your thoughts. And I particularly liked your conclusion on what you found when looking at the US big giants, how much they spent on R&D, the Huawei case. For all our listeners and viewers, tune right in next time again. See you next time.